Meeting to order, and I'll stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, she'll be nice, because usually I'm doing this by myself. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one. All right, so I need a motion to approve the agenda. Motion and a second. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, that passes. All right, next we will take, we'll have Paul Northington will give us information about the tax rate levy hearing for, this is the tax rate levy hearing for 2020, 2021. Take it away.
Yes, good evening, good evening.
Evening.
Tax rates, calendar year 2020. This year, as we get through this, you'll see that there's going to be minimal changes to the tax rate. But good news is that it's going to be a little bit lower than last year. If you recall, when we were here this time a year ago, we had a pretty good reduction in the tax rate ceiling. It went down about 20 cents. This year, as we go through that, you'll notice that it's going down a little less than a nickel. But the trend is still downward. I'm going to provide you some background information regarding the calculation process in regards to assessed valuation and how that plays into the tax calculation, and also talk about the recoupment process. Those are the two things that really affect the tax rate. And then I'll turn it over to Dan, where he can give you some of the financial details as it played into this year and how that relates to budget, and also give you a proposed tax rate for your approval this evening. And then at the end, we'll open up for any questions you may have. So that being said, why is it necessary to adjust the tax rate? And two factors really come into play each year, and we're required annually to adjust the tax rate. One thing is changes in our assessed valuation reassessment, and the other item is recoupment. And again, if you recall, last year was a reassessment year, and property values went up over 7%, and the tax calculation only allows us to realize the higher or the lower of the CPI, or 5%, and the CPI is a consumer price index, and it hasn't been anywhere close to 5% in a long time. So we've been limited by the consumer price index for quite some time. Last year the CPI was 1.9%, and even though we had a 7% increase in property values, we could only, based on the calculation, only increase tax revenue by the CPI of 1.9%. So that's where we were last year, and that's why the tax rate went down 20 cents. This year is a non-reassessment year, and property values didn't change much. So reassessment really didn't come into play in the tax rate calculation, and we're kind of in that middle area in that reassessed properties increased by less than 1%, so it was well below the CPI, so it played little or no effect on the tax rate. The other point to note is new construction and increases in personal property also don't come into the calculation, so the district gets to realize the benefit of any of those two items. So changes in assessed valuation really didn't come into play this year as far as affecting the tax rate. What did was some of the recoupment processes, and that's the second component of the calculation of the tax rate. And each year when we set the tax rate, oftentimes there are taxpayers who appeal their property values and their payment of taxes to either the Board of Equalization, and the Board of Equalization can either keep the value the same, or they can lower the value after we set the tax rate. And if that happens, then we can recover that lost revenue in the following year. The second component of that is if the taxpayer does not agree with the Board of Equalization, they can also appeal that to the State Tax Commission. So if property values are changed by either of those two entities, then we can go back and recoup that the following year because we have based our information on a higher value at the time we set the tax rate. How does recoupment work? Recoupment is really a two-step process. When settlements are provided to taxpayers either by the Board of Equalization or the State Tax Commission, That may span over a couple of years, so we will use the state auditor's forms to recast each of those years that were changed and assign a new tax rate ceiling for each of those years. And then from there, the step 2 is that we calculate the lost revenue for each of those years, and we spread that recoupment over a 3-year period. So if the lost value was, for example, say $1,000, we would spread that over 3 years, which would be $333 a year. So that's recoupment in its simplest form. Who develops the calculation forms and what oversight is there? And the short answer to that is Missouri State Auditor's Office regulates the whole process. They're the ones that prepare the forms and send them to the school districts in the state of Missouri. Typically, when we get the forms, we do a pro forma calculation, and we'll send it to the state auditor's office for review prior to coming here this evening. We'll get feedback from them. After the hearing this evening, assuming the board approves the rates that are proposed, we will take these rates to the county office so they can record them on their tax rolls, and then that information is sent to the state auditor's office. The state auditor will review that and provide a certification to the school district. We typically get that turnaround fairly quickly in the next couple of days, and the state auditor will certify that the district is compliant with the state laws when setting the tax rates. So it's heavily regulated by the Missouri State Auditor's Office, and it's the same for all school districts, public school districts across the state. So what factors impacted the 2020 tax rate calculation? As I mentioned earlier, 2020 is a non-reassessment year, so we had very little changes in assessed valuation of existing properties, less than 1%. So it played a very small role in the tax rate, if any. Assessed valuation, as you can see, less new construction increased by only 0.23%. And overall, with new construction, our increase is 1.28%. New construction, as you can see, was about $43 million this year. And increases in reassessed properties was only about $10 million. So you can see the largest part of our growth this year was in new construction. And then the bottom part of that is really what played into the change in our tax rate. You can see in previous years we had AV reductions due to settlements that ranged in the several $1 million range. But in 2020 that was less than $1 million. So that is what's driving our tax rate down this year, and it recoups a lot less. The reduction, as you'll see here in a little bit when Dan goes over, is about 4.84 cents, so it's just a little less than a nickel. And it may not sound like much, but each penny for the district equates to about $400,000. So that 484 in real dollars is about $2 million less in recoupment that will be recovering as compared to previous years. I'll turn it over to Dan now and let him talk about some of the numbers and tax rates.
Good evening. So this slide just shows a comparison of the prior year tax rate. So last year we had a tax rate ceiling of 3.5487 with the debt service was 42287, and then if you add in the recoupment, we had a approved tax rate of 4.3463. So we budgeted the tax rate to remain relatively flat. We did account for a decrease in the recoupment just based off the data that we had through the budget process last spring. So as you can see in the far right column, when we run everything through the state auditor's forms, we have a tax rate ceiling of 3.5493. We add on our debt service, which we have a commitment to keep at the 68 cents to fund our general obligation liabilities. So we are proposing a tax rate ceiling of 4.2293, and then we add in the recoupment. Our total tax rate would be 4.2985. So by comparative purposes, it is less than what we budgeted. So we do have a decrease in our operational funding compared to our budget of about 1.1 million. We also have, it's relatively flat in regards to prior year. And then as you can see, to a homeowner, based on an average market value of $250,000, a decrease of roughly $23 to their taxes. So this is a slide that shows at least the historical tax rate ceilings, as well as our assessed valuation. In the last 8 years, our assessed valuation has increased just less than $1 billion. So we've seen significant growth. Most of that has been achieved in the last 2 reassessment years. We have a maximum authorized tax rate ceiling of 4.14, and this year you can see we're well below that at 3.5493. So overall, we'll be recommending a tax rate of 4.2985 based off of a assessed valuation of $4.2 billion. Here's our breakdown of our tax rate by our funds. So the incidental, teachers, and capital, that's what we commonly refer to as our operating funds. And then our debt services, again, that funds our principal and interest payments on our outstanding debt. So our assessed revenues, when we take the calculation, we expect revenue of $173.9 million to receive. So that's our 97%. That's at our 97% collection rate. And I think Paul, I'll turn back to Paul to kind of wrap it up.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, just some key points to note here to kind of summarize things is that the district's operating tax rate increased again by 20 cents in the previous year and about 4.78 cents this year. So the decrease was again, but it was substantially smaller. The other thing to point out is our debt service rate has remained at 68 cents for quite some time. Matter of fact, it goes back to 2009. So we've been able to keep our debt service levy constant for well over 10 years. The other point to note is that the big unknown that we have in our budget year is the collection rate, given the current COVID environment. And we've put that in our budget at 97%. That's kind of been our historical norm over the last 3 or 4 years. But it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out given the current situation. If you go back to 08-09 when we had the housing crisis and things, we saw that collection rate drop down to the 93-94% range. Hopefully we won't see that this year. But to put that in perspective, every time it drops 1%, it's about $1.7 million. So if we were to see our collection rate go from 97, let's say, to 94, that's about a $5 million hit on collection of local tax revenues. So that's something we're really going to monitor really close as the tax collections start coming in December and January, and we'll certainly keep you posted as that starts to materialize. And then again, COVID has changed some of our expenditure allocations. There's been some cost avoidance opportunities, but there's also been some additional items that we've had to incur to accommodate the current environment. And most adversely affected has been our self-supporting activities. It's been our community education, and it's also been our child nutrition services and the fact that when school's been closed, we're not serving meals and things of that nature. And then again, our goal is to remain fiscally responsible, and we're going to make sure that continues to happen. We want to make sure we preserve our AAA rating. So we covered a lot in a short period of time, so now we'll open it up to any questions you may have.
I have a question. Paul, you mentioned that the $1.7 million deficit when there's a decrease. Is that correct?
1.7 million lost in revenue
Per 1%.
for each 1% that it drops.
And then you mentioned that, so you'll be looking at that in January. Now, that's when we will have started the budget planning for 21-22 already. How will that reflect in our budget planning?
Well, we've kind of moved our budget timeline back. We propose to move our budget timeline back a little bit so that we can get a better picture of where we are. And typically, we come to the board with a preliminary budget in December. This year, we're proposing to bring a preliminary budget in February to give us time to really look at how this plays out in December and January.
And will that then have a serious effect on like our hiring and allocations that we'll need to make if we have to wait till February?
It really won't affect the way that The end goal will still be the same. It won't affect any of the operational activities that we have as far as working with buildings and departments on their budgets. It still gives us time to flush all that out. Still gives us time to do the appropriate staffing level decisions that we need to do. And we'll still fit our timeline that we typically do, where we give you an update in May. That will still happen, and then we'll do the final budget adoption in June. So the end timeline is not being moved back. We're just moving back to preliminary from December to February. But we'll catch back up as we get through that.
See the wisdom of doing that so you have more accurate numbers. Is that right?
Yes, we'll
Okay.
be able to give you a better picture of where we're at.
Yeah.
So that's the rationale
Okay.
for moving that back.
Yeah, thank you
If
for
we were
explaining
to
that.
have this discussion in December, we'd still have the big question mark about tax collections.
Thank you for explaining
As
that.
Paul and I talked about that earlier this year, we just thought that shift would enable us to have more information based upon that collection and see where we are.
Questions?
Just like to take a moment to acknowledge Dan Steinbrugge and Paul Northington, as well as the entire finance department, for the work they put into preparing this presentation every single year. It's very informative and very thorough. So just want to say thanks to you and your department, as always.
And they make
you.
it understandable.
True, true.
So too. Without further ado, I need a motion to adopt the following tax rate levy for the 2020-21 school year. If after validation by the Missouri State Auditor, the tax rate ceiling allowed is less than or greater than the approved rate, the superintendent is hereby authorized to set the final rates for the district as validated by the State of Missouri Auditor.
Moved.
Motion is second. Any discussion? All right, so I'm not going to read that whole motion again, but we all know what the motion is. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, that passes. Is there anything else? I don't think so. Let's adjourn the meeting.